This is Christopher Sernaque hosting episode 19 of season 3 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Today on Current Topics in Science, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Jerry Bergman. Dr. Bergman has 9 degrees, an associate in biology and behavioral science, a bachelor's in sociology, biology, and psychology, a master of science in occupational health, a master of science in public health, a master of science in biomedical science, a master of arts in social psychology, a master of education in counseling and psychology, a PhD in human biology, and a PhD in measurement and evaluation with a minor in psychology. Dr. Bergman is or was active in over 22 professional organizations, such as the American Psychological Association, the National Association for the Advancement of Science, and the American Association of Suicidology. He is a fellow of the American Scientific Affiliation, is the president and founder of the Society for the Scientific Study of Male Psychology and Physiology, and is a member of Mensa, the largest and oldest high IQ society in the world. Dr. Bergman has over 1,500 publications in 12 languages and has authored over 40 books and monographs. His books and textbooks that include chapters that he's authored in over 1,500 college libraries in 27 countries. His other work experience includes over a decade's worth of experience at various mental health and psychological clinics as a licensed professional clinical counselor. And now, without further ado, good morning, Dr. Bergman. How was your day, and how are you doing?
It's good to be here. Appreciate the nice words you said about my background.
You're welcome, Dr. Bergman. It is an honor to have you here. And since this is Current Topics in Science, we're going to quickly look at this week's current topic. So we're going to be looking at an article. It's by Jeff Jacoby called Richard Dawkins and Eugenics. This is about how Richard Dawkins advocates for reducing undesirable populations by preventing them from being born in the first place. So this article brought up how Dawkins told a woman who was pregnant with a baby who had been prenatally diagnosed with Down syndrome to abort it, meaning her baby, and try again. It would be immoral to bring it into the world if you have the choice. The article continues, he, Dawkins, an advocate of eugenics, which held that undesirable populations should be reduced or eliminated by preventing them from being born in the first place. So, Dr. Bergman, what do you think of this article? And what are the psychological implications, if there are any, of a society wholly embracing all that the Darwinian worldview entails?
Well, we know what the results are. We have, of course, Nazi Germany as well as other countries that have implemented this with, I might add, good intentions at first. But we know where it went to. And in fact, the first case they had in Nazi Germany was a child that was born severely deformed, had many, many major problems. And the doctors contacted the German government, Adolf Hitler specifically, and asked that if this child could be euthanized. And he said yes. And this basically opened the door to eventually euthanization, killing of people that they thought were undesirable, like, of course, Jews and Gypsies and Slavics and many other people. And so we know where it leads. The example that Dawkins talked about, Down syndrome, is interesting because if you've ever worked with Down syndrome children, or trisomy 21 is the technical term, you will find they are among the loveliest, the nicest, the most interesting, loving kids you'll ever meet. And therefore, it's tragic in many ways because now they can live to be 50, 60 and have productive lives. They can work and do different jobs. Now, of course, they're not going to live a normal life, or what we call a normal life. But on the other hand, they can live very good and happy lives. And I have a number of friends who have Down syndrome children or Down syndrome relatives, and I've gotten to know, therefore, some of them, and they're really a delight to be around. The best example was when I worked briefly in a home for retarded children. It was what we called it then. term isn't used today, but there were a number of children that had very severe defects. And invariably, to help these children, they had the Down syndrome girls come over and help them. And boy, they were just lovely caretakers with these kids. And so you really appreciate them. When tourists walk through the home, the Down syndrome children would really attach themselves to the tourists. And when they would leave, they would cry, "Oh, I miss you. And it was so nice that you came," and so on. And in many ways, they were very childlike, but very endearing children. And therefore, if you work with Down syndrome children, you can see that this is at least to start this eugenics program, as Dawkins advocated, this is the wrong place to start. Even in Nazi Germany, they didn't start at that level.
So Dr. Bergman, in our first question, we examined a quotation from Richard Dawkins. He's a leader in the new atheist movement. Avery Foley, who has her MA in theological studies, she commented on the religion of atheism and whether or not it can provide grounds for meaning. And she wrote that in the atheistic religion, not only is each individual human rushing headlong toward the grave, so is our very universe. Our species, just like every other species, is destined for extinction. None of our accomplishments, advancements, breakthroughs, triumphs, or heartbreaks will ultimately matter as we face extinction along with our universe. This is certainly a bleak and hopeless perspective. So, Dr. Bergman, what are the psychological implications, if there are any, of accepting atheism?
Well, this doesn't forebode a very positive future. It's almost like telling you before you enroll in a course, you're going to fail in this course. You're not going to succeed. There's no way you can succeed in this course. This course is way too difficult. You're setting them up for failure. And the idea that the universe will eventually basically disappear, it'll self-destruct. Well, this is a belief based on certain events, but can we carry that in the future? Do we really know the universe is going to end? The reason they conclude it's going to end is because the universe we know is expanding. We have good evidence that indeed it's expanding, but that doesn't mean it will expand forever. It may not, and there's a lot of things we don't know about the fate of the universe. And judging by past experience, many predictions we made turned out to be wrong. And so it's a bleak picture, which doesn't psychologically help us look forward to the future. And it's something that gets in the way of trying to be an optimistic relative to the future and our life and what we can do.
And actually, and before we go on, I hope you don't mind if I go a little bit off script, but I wanted to actually touch on something that you said. So when we look at Dawkins' comments about these children, it seems that your experience with all of the children with Down syndrome was so completely different than the way Dawkins would have it be believed or portrayed. Like, do you think that his worldview is influencing the way he's thinking about these other people?
Oh, no question it is. No question. One other quick example. One girl, I was, from the record, she had an IQ of 50. And when I met her in person, she was elected homecoming queen for her school that she was attending at that time. And she wanted to get married and have children. And the thought is, in our minds, is should a girl with an IQ of 50 get married and have a child? Can she really deal with that? But I just can't describe how lovely of a girl she was and how she really just wanted to have a family. And I thought there must be some way to help her fulfill her dreams, because people telling her, and they said, well, you can't get married, you can't have any children. It just brought tears to her eyes. And you just felt so bad about what she wanted to do and what they said she couldn't do. And I'm not sure, of course, I wasn't working there not long after that, but I just felt so bad about this girl. She was one that you'd never forget. And yet it didn't sound to me like she had an IQ of 50, but that's what the record said. So not only wondering about the validity of intelligence tests, but I really wonder indeed, is there a way that we can help accommodate this young girl and so she can have her dream fulfilled and maybe work in an institution where she can take care of young children under supervision. So there were alternatives, and just the labeling process, which is of course what Dawkins doing. Dawkins would say an IQ of 50, well, that's 100 is average. 50 is not even educably mentally retarded. It's below that. And therefore, what they wanted to do was sterilize her. And of course, this, I think, was going back to, of course, in the United States, when we sterilized hundreds of thousands of young girls because we felt for some reason they should not bear children because they were not intellectually or whatever socially capable of doing so. And so this is a little young girl you'll never forget. She just was so delightful talking to and being with.
That was a heartwarming story, and I have to say, like, it was. I don't even know if appalling is a strong enough word to. They just wanted to crush not only her dreams, but then even sterilize her. I mean, to me, that was kind of shocking.
Well, yeah, but again, good intentions, but they can lead to horrific results, and that was my concern. Of course, I had no authority to determine what her fate was. This was up to the administrators of the home where she was at, the school where she was at. But I just was concerned. Some people you just never forget, and she's one that I just never forgot, and was very concerned about what her life would be like. But on the other hand, I had no basis of affecting it, and just hope the authorities, and I let my feelings be known to the authorities, but of course they have to evaluate her on the basis of other criteria as well.
Well, to actually go back to Dawkins, as evidenced from his quote, the theistic and then the atheistic worldview, they have very different approaches to human worth. And with that in mind, let us examine what evolutionary psychology has to say about human nature. According to an article by Dr. Steve Taylor, evolutionary psychology explains present-day human traits and characteristics in terms of the survival value they possess for our ancestors. These traits have survived because the genes they are linked to were selected and have remained part of our genetic heritage. So, Dr. Bergman, is human nature better explained by creationary or evolutionary psychology?
Well, evolutionary psychology, of course, would say that those with, quote, inferior genes would be less likely to reproduce or produce fewer offspring, and therefore those genes would eventually disappear from the gene pool. But on the other hand, when you work with a wide variety of people, you can see there are people who have inferior genes, but yet they do very well in certain areas. And of course, the classic example, and there are many, is the artist who's incredibly talented, who is able to produce artworks that are almost photographs, and yet he's deficient in other areas. And we find this is true of many people who started out life as people felt they could never succeed because they had major deficiencies. Well, the absent-minded professor is a good example. The Einsteinian example, where here's a man who changed the world, but yet in many ways he was illiterate. He couldn't write very well. He couldn't spell very well. He didn't do very well in school. He survived in school only because some of his friends were good students and took good notes, and he was able to learn from those good notes, and therefore did what he did, which is change the world. In fact, Albert Einstein is seen as the epitome of intelligence and wisdom, but yet in so many areas, he was retarded. He just didn't do very well. One of the most famous, of course, is his dress. He wore the same clothes pretty much throughout the year, no matter how warm and how cold it was. And when someone asked him, why do you dress with these clothes? You're not going to stay cool in the summer or stay warm in the winter. You're kind of in between. He says, well, you have so much time in a day. And if you have to sit and decide what clothes you want to wear and make those decisions, it just wastes time. And so I have a set of clothes I wear pretty much every day, and they do fine in most days. And some days I'm a little bit chilly. Some days I'm a little bit too warm, but it's not a major concern. How I look is not a major concern. A major concern is my work that I'm doing. And he just was not a good dresser at all, as we know, as is very famous. I guess he didn't even own a comb. He didn't comb his hair. He just let it be where it was. But on the other hand, look at what he did do in changing our world. E equals MC squared, of course, is the most famous example, where we realize now the relationship between matter and energy. Energy is another form of matter, and matter is another form of energy. And so that changed the world, and that is intuitively doesn't make sense. It's not logical how matter could become energy and vice versa. But on the other hand, that was proven, of course, with the development of the atomic bomb. We know it's true because we've done the research. And so this is a man who is deficient in many areas, but yet he was able to excel in several areas which changed the world. And I should stress, he was deficient in many areas. He had a very hard time as a youth. He was a lousy teacher. He had a hard time working. He had a hard time getting a job. He had a hard time getting through school. He had very severe problems, but yet look at what he did. So you got to be careful on judging people on what they don't have. You have to look more at what skills they do have and what they can do in spite of their shortcomings.
So Dr. Bergman, it sounds like what you're saying is that the creationary psychology worldview provides a more realistic and a more wholesome approach to human nature than evolutionary psychology, which seems to have sort of, I guess, like a tunnel visioned onto, well, this seems to be the better gene, and so this probably should make it, but in actuality, there's other factors that it's not taking into account. Now, can the creation view of origins account now for the main tenets of evolutionary psychology? According to Lida Cosmides and John Tooby, these are two of the world's most influential evolutionary psychologists, there are 6 main tenets of evolutionary psychology. So we're going to go over each of these tenets together one by one, and we'll see how they stack up to reality. So this is the first tenet of evolutionary psychology. The brain is a computer designed by natural selection to extract information from the environment. Dr. Bergman, what do you think of this first tenet?
Well, the brain is certainly there and it certainly has functions, but I think one of the best examples is my mother, who had Alzheimer's. And she could not communicate, could not take care of herself at all in any way, shape, or form. But yet every now and then, I remember, it wasn't common, but every now and then she would behave very lucidly, just like she was before she developed Alzheimer's. And I remember one time, she hadn't said anything for all day, and she hadn't done anything. She laid there for the entire day. And all of a sudden, she stated very clearly, "It is awful warm in this room. Could you please turn the heat down?" And this is totally out of the blue. And we thought, well, she's coming out of it. She'll be normal now. Well, it didn't happen, of course, because that was all she said. And she didn't say anything more for quite a while. But that to me said very clearly that mother was still there. Even though she could not let out, she could not behave normally, she could not talk or do anything normally, she could not feed herself normally, she had to be fed through a tube. On the other hand, mother was still there. She was still my mother. And the problem was not that she wasn't there. The problem was she could not get out. She could not express herself because of her disease, of course, Alzheimer's. And this was an experience which I witnessed and I saw. And so therefore, it had a profound effect on me. And it caused me to realize that you're not just matter made out of meat. You are much more than that. The brain is there and it's important, it's damaged, certain things will happen. That's true. But on the other hand, you are much more than just a piece of meat, as they call the brain. And so therefore, this is a very narrow view to conclude all you are is cells. You are nothing more than that. And indeed, the creationary psychology worldview would say we are much more than a bunch of cells. And so to limit people according to physical cells is very narrow-minded, very, very ignorant, very wrong.
And so actually, we're going to go now to the second tenet of evolutionary psychology. It says individual human behavior is generated by this evolved computer in response to information it extracts from the environment. So understanding behavior requires articulating the cognitive programs that generate this behavior. Dr. Bergman, do you believe that this second tenet is accurate?
Well, the problem with that is that human beings are all too often unpredictable. And the secular evolutionists say, well, that's because we don't understand all the factors that's going into their mind. But to conclude we are nothing more than a mechanical machine really delimits us. And there are many, many examples that one could illustrate, which shows it does limit us unnecessarily. And one good example is at times I went into a meeting and I went into that meeting specifically wanting to say a certain thing relative to the situation I was in. And I got into the meeting, I sat down and I said the exact opposite. And after I said that, I wondered, why would I hurt myself and say the exact opposite. Why did I do that? And that was 30 years ago, and I still remember that today. And it reminds me of Paul, where he talked about things that he said and wondered why he would say these things. And is that me speaking? Where do those things come from? And so likewise, what I said, and I knew it was not rational to say what I said before I said it, but yet I still said it. And I did not retract what I said afterward. And today I have to wonder, where was I? Where was I during that time period? I wasn't there. Someone else was there. And I have to wonder where that someone else was, which is, of course, exactly what Paul said. Why do I say the things that I say? I don't always understand me and why I do what I do. And we don't all too often. Now, true, we have habits like we're alcoholics and we say, I'm not going to drink again, and we do, and so on. But that's something different. This is something very clear where I was not under compulsion to say what I said. There was no reason to say what I said. What I said was wrong, and I shouldn't have said it, but I did, and I have to wonder why. Why did those words come out when I rehearsed what I was going to say before I went into the room, and yet I didn't say what I rehearsed, what I should have said?
That's pretty incredible. So it's almost like you're saying that on one hand, we have the brain, which is the mechanical part of it, but then we have the mind.
I think in many ways, yes, we do. In many ways we do, although they're certainly connected. But to me, the mind has to get through the brain. It's got to get through the physical world. And that seems to be the problem. I'm trying to think of the scripture where Paul said that. We say things that we realize are not true, and we wonder why we say them.
Was that Romans 7? That I do that which I would not, and that which I would do that I do not do, something along those lines. I wanted to ask you, so how do you think, if you don't mind me going off script again, how do you think this relates to, say, like the Jungian and Freudian ideas? You have the shadow, then you have the id, the ego, the superego. How do you think all of that relates to the experience you're articulating?
Well, Freud has been pretty much disproved now. He's not taught widely, although when I went to college and Wayne State University, we, of course, learned all about Freud. I had courses on Freud and his ideas and so on, but many of them have been refuted. But on the other hand, I think the id, the superego, et cetera, we do seem to have three levels of awareness. And so I think probably in that idea, he's probably accurate. We have a subconscious, which affects us. But it's not that it's hidden there. It's just, it's there and influences us. And if we thought about it, we could probably understand what our subconscious thoughts were, our motives behind what we say were. So by and large, Freud many of his ideas, the Oedipus complex and so on, are now seen as silly. And yet he was taken seriously for years.
And with that in mind, do you want to look at now the third tenet? So we looked at the computerized programs. This second one, it goes along with cognitive programs. So it says, the cognitive programs of the human brain are adaptations. They exist because they produced behavior in our ancestors that enabled them to survive and reproduce. So do you believe that this is scientifically accurate, Dr. Bergman?
Well, the problem with that statement is that so much of what we do does not help our survival. It does not. It's like people who are determined to be an artist, and yet they have no talent, and they produce all kinds of paintings, and you wonder, what would this skill have in the past? Now, you could come up with reasons. Well, if they were good artists, they probably could communicate better and therefore were more likely to survive. But on the other hand, there are so many behaviors that we have that are incredibly talented, that we really can't explain through evolution. Probably the best example, because I've looked into this quite a bit, is musical talent. We have enormous musical talent, and I guess I appreciate because I don't. I had guitar lessons for a number of years, and I think I could strum out one or two songs, and not very well at that. But there are people I know who they pick it up quickly. They are incredibly talented. They play the piano, for example, by sound, by hearing the music, and then can reproduce it. And you wonder how in the world these people can do this. And was this a skill that helped us in the past? Now, evolutionists try to explain it, and they generally explain it by, this helps socially. So therefore, if I have a musical talent, I'm more apt to find a mate, more apt to have children. Well, I don't know if many women look for men who are good singers. I mean, they might find attractive a man who's a good singer and done well in the field and has done well economically in the field. But on the other hand, and it's a nice talent to have, but I'm not sure many people judge potential spouses on the basis of their musical ability. This may be part of it, but there are other things that are far more important. And so therefore, so much of what we can do is not connected to survival at all. And musical ability would be kind of the sterling example, where indeed people have enormous skills that it's just hard to believe what they can do. Their fingers just fly over the keys, for example, and they come out with incredible music, and they have never had a music lesson. They can't read music, but yet they reproduce and create incredibly beautiful sounds. And how would this in the future help us with survival? It, by and large, wouldn't, except socially it may, but on the other hand, there are other social skills that are far more effective in attracting mates, like being nice, by being a nice person, by being an attractive person in other ways. And music is certainly, for most of us, is, my wife is an incredibly good piano player, but that's not the main thing by far that attracted me. That's just nice that she has that skill. But on the other hand, if she didn't have that skill, it would not affect my perception of her in the least.
And so this next one, this fourth tenet, it sort of is building off the last one. It says the cognitive programs of the human brain, they may not be adaptive now, but they were adaptive in the ancestral environments. And so it almost sounds like they're saying, well, you might be doing something now that doesn't seem to help your survival, but back then, this was very useful. So what do you think about this fourth tenet?
Well, that's what they try to attribute the ability to produce musical sounds from. In the past, it helped us. In the past, it was important, but yet there's just no evidence that that was true. And when people get around campfires, telling stories, and maybe far more important than being musical. It may help, yes, that's true, but I'm not sure that's all that important in attracting mates. And so therefore, to say that, well, it was useful in the past, that's a projection which may or may not be true. It's almost like saying, well, where did the first life evolve at? Well, it couldn't have evolved on the earth because the conditions were not appropriate ever on the earth for life to evolve. So therefore, it must have evolved somewhere else and it came to the earth. This directed panspermia idea. Well, that just moves the problem somewhere else. It doesn't solve it. Well, if life evolved on some planet in the Andromeda galaxy, well, how did it evolve there? We got the same problem there as we have here. In fact, probably more problems there than here. And so putting it off to somewhere else doesn't solve it. It doesn't help us understand where indeed, in this case, life came from. And so the same thing with trying to say, well, this was useful in the past. Well, you can, I suppose, say that about most everything, but that's not proof. That's just speculation or thinking about what could be true in the past. But thoughts are free. They don't cost anything, and they may or may not be true, and that's, not always that important.
So it sounds like you're saying this is more of a just so story than it is an actual line of scientific evidence.
Right. That's a good way of putting it. Just so story.
Well, actually, in the first tenet, they mentioned natural selection. Now, in this fifth one, they bring it up again. They say natural selection ensures that the brain is composed of many different special purpose programs and not a domain general architecture. What do they mean by that, and what do you think of this, Dr. Bergman?
Well, from my study, I understood that the brain works as a whole and parts specialized, like Wernicke's area, or Broca's area, have very important specializations, but they work in conjunction with the rest of the brain. And so I wonder if indeed that anatomy and physiologically, if that's correct, that indeed the brain is a very important part of our body, but on the other hand, the brain has an influence throughout the body. And the stomach, for example, not feeling depressed affects the whole body. And so in many ways, to isolate the brain from the body is problematic. That I would say you try to isolate things, and it's difficult because the entire brain-body system works as a unit. And therefore, you have to understand it as a unit working together. And this isolation idea is, I think, problematic. Although, again, certain parts, Wernicke's area has a very important role in speech. And if you lose it, if it's damaged by stroke, for example, you're going to lose that aspect of speech. But on the other hand, you can still communicate through other means. And so it's not the only means of communication. So there are certain areas that are obviously more important, but you really can't understand any part of the brain without understanding the entire body as a unit.
That's really incredible. So you're saying that the brain, you can't look at it as if it's its own entity apart from the rest of the body. You need to factor how both things influence one another. If you don't mind me going off script again, what are some ways that the brain does influence the body and vice versa? Just a few examples of that relationship.
Well, a good example is I used to work for a pain center. We dealt with people who had pain. We had one man, I'm not sure how he did this, but he was huge, and he lifted an engine out of a car. I don't know why he didn't have a lift to do this, but this is what the report said. And as a result, he had severe back problems. And you can't deal with that fully with medication. You try to deal with it somewhat with medication, but he ends up being very sleepy and very tired. And so we tried biofeedback. And I remember him very well because we explained how the biofeedback works and how he's supposed to cause the needle to go down. And he probably did a better job than anybody I worked with. You would tell him what to do, and that needle on that meter, it was a thermal measurement by the skin on the finger, and that needle just went down. And I asked him, how do you do that? I mean, I can't even do it. I'm the guy trying to help you do it. And I don't, and he says, I just do it. You know, he wasn't lying and saying I hurt when he didn't hurt. He did hurt. And therefore he was able to reduce the pain considerably. And that helped me understand indeed how the body and the brain and the mind are all connected. And he was able to reduce the pain, which of course, the source of pain is in the brain. It's not, you know, your finger hurts, but the message is sent to your brain, and the hurt is a result of your brain's interpretation of that pain. So the pain, in essence, is not in your finger, or your back, or elsewhere. It's in your mind. And this is why when you lose an arm, for example, you have the phantom limb syndrome, which you still have the pain in the arm, which is not there. Well, how could that occur? Well, the brain receives messages from that area, and it interprets the pain as being from the arm. And so phantom limb phenomena is important in understanding that all pain is psychosomatic. It's all in your brain, but it's not, you can't say it's not there because it's there because the messages it gets from the body. So you have to understand the brain-body connection, and this is a good example of how connected the body is.
So, Dr. Bergman, we've arrived at the final tenet of evolutionary psychology, which says, describing the evolved computational architecture of our brains allows a systematic understanding of cultural and social phenomena. So, Dr. Bergman, what do you think of this final tenet of evolutionary psychology?
Well, the problem with that is that you have a preconceived idea, and then you enter in the field being blinded to some degree by that preconceived idea, or that preconceived idea affects what you look for and what you find. So my orientation is we need to look at these questions not with a preconceived ideas looking for an answer, but we need to have lots of possibilities and evaluate them as we look into, in this case, the brain. And I find that problematic because we tend to assume many things. For example, why do people get angry? Well, they get angry because we evolved from apes, and apes commonly get angry. They have tempers, or they behave irrationally. Well, they do, and we do too as well, but that doesn't mean that our behavior is a result of apes' behavior. It could well be that we get angry because that's what our culture teaches. And we know that because there are some cultures like the Japanese and the Chinese culture, they basically help them not get angry. If you get angry when you're a child, you socialize not to get angry, not to be emotional, but to respond rationally and with kindness, etc. And so interestingly, after World War II ended, a number of people who were there right after the war said one thing they could not understand was after we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki and many of the major cities and killed hundreds of millions of Japanese, yet they found amazingly the Japanese were so incredibly nice to the American occupiers of Japan. I mean, they were just dumbfounded how we did so much destruction and how so incredibly nice and kind they were. And when several people, one example is Bill O'Reilly, who mentioned this in his book, but when you ask these people, why are you so kind? It's a horrible war. We did horrible damage to your country. Why are you so kind? And they said, we were taught to behave that way. That's what we were socialized to do, is not to be angry, not to get mad, but to be kind to people in society, not in war, of course. War, they were socialized with other behavior. But so many people were amazed at how kind and considerate they were, in spite of the damage that we did to their country. So this is a good example where, yeah, we can, through socialization, we can show our anger, and that anger can be rewarded, as it is often in children. But on the other hand, that anger can be squelched by socialization, and the Japanese especially did so. And as a result, they are well known as being just kind people, even in the most difficult circumstances.
Well, thank you for going over and addressing each of the 6 tenets. I did have a question about them. This is kind of general. So we looked at the 6 tenets of the evolutionary psychology model. Now, can the creation model account for these 6 tenets, or what would be a creation perspective on these 6 tenets?
Well, the creation model would say that the human mind is designed for a specific purpose. And what that purpose is to, love everybody, love your neighbor as yourself, to express yourself in very effective ways. Language is important, speech is important, controlling your temper is important, words are important, being good people, good parents, good friends, good neighbors, good Christians. The word Christian means basically, for many people, Christian means behaving well. You need to behave like a Christian. And that means meek, submissive, hardworking, etc. And so that would say that our body and our brain is designed to behave in certain ways. It's true, it doesn't always behave that way, but we are deviating from the original design. In fact, one study recently, it's assumed for a long time that anger is good because it helps you get it out. And therefore, psychologists said, and that's what I was taught in school, anger is good because you need to get it out, get out the anger, get out your feelings of anger. It's good to ventilate. It's good to express your feelings. Well, now studies are finding that's not such a good idea because anger reinforces that behavior, and then we're more apt to revert to that behavior in the future. And problematically, anger often doesn't solve the problem. If I have a problem with you and I get angry and call you names, that doesn't help our relationship much. And so anger can actually do more harm than good in interpersonal relationships. And so now more and more the feeling is in psychology that we should not freely ventilate. We should learn to control our anger, which of course, as the scriptures say. And so Christianity gives a very different picture of how we should behave. And psychology research is finding that picture is accurate. And indeed, the Bible was right all the time, and all the time.
Well, Dr. Bergman, in the last question, we went over evolutionary psychology, but it naturally begs the question, what would one expect to find if they approach psychology from a creationary perspective? And you went over some of that in the last response, or in the last response to the general answer. But let's take a look at this. So, for instance, we find that males score higher in trait conscientiousness than females. They score higher in trait agreeableness, which would actually seem to correlate to the tasks appointed to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. And additionally, research done by archaeologists such as Gavin Cox, it demonstrates that humans have been intelligent since the beginning, which is contrary to the, knuckle-dragging caricature. So in other words, Dr. Bergman, what psychological predictions would you make or would one expect based off of the biblical worldview?
Well, I would say relative to the intelligence from the beginning, when I studied ancient history in college, it surprised me how lucid and how accurate and how insightful ancients that wrote 4,000 years ago, the Egyptians, we have translations of their writing. And as a result, it just surprised me how modern and how insightful so much their writing was, which to me indicates that, yes, we were human and intelligent from the beginning. We did not start out with grunts, and grunts evolved into language. From what we know, the earliest writing was accurate, and we have no evidence of the origin of alphabets or language, etc. The first alphabet was indeed very, very insightful. The first communication by signs was, I should say, alphabet came along later. But we can see that indeed they were very effective in communicating, and it doesn't indicate any evidence that whatsoever that these communications started out as grunts or started out as lines and scratches on something. But they indeed were complex from the beginning. Of course, the scriptures teach that Adam and Eve, as soon as they were created, had a language, could speak, could communicate, and could write, I guess, if they wanted to, or at least could use written communication in some way to communicate effectively ideas. And so therefore, from what I studied in ancient history, we indeed has verified what the scripture had to say, and not what the evolutionary psychologists claim, that we evolved from grunts and grunt. And that's the common teaching, that grunts was the beginning of language. We grunted, and the grunts became more refined and more refined, and eventually we had language from those grunts. And that is a picture portrayed in cartoons, in the media, etc., but there's just no evidence for that. Eve, of course, would confirm that Adam talked to God and to Eve right away. First time they met each other, they could communicate with each other, they could talk to each other, and each other understood each other. They could, when Eve said something, Adam understood it. And so and they had no instruction in language. Language was innate. In many ways, we understand now that language is innate. It's just fine-tuned by the environment. That babies pick up language pretty much automatically. They have a language learning center, which of course Chomsky talked about. They have a center in the brain, basically, that language is there from birth on. It's just we have to fine-tune it. We have to make the language center use our language that we use, but it's there, but just not our specific language. And so if you're in France, French is the language that center is programmed with. In Germany, German is. In Russia, Russian is. And so what we observe in reality conforms to the biblical worldview and not the evolutionary worldview.
Well, Dr. Bergman, it definitely sounds like the biblical approach. It certainly offers numerous lines of fruitful research. And in contrast to this, in Chapter 32 of the Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology, Randolph Nesse wrote, "Evolutionary researchers have not found a new treatment for a single mental disorder, so why should mental health clinicians and researchers care about evolutionary psychology?" So, Dr. Bergman, from your perspective, does the Darwinian theory impede the science of psychology?
Oh, in many ways it impedes. And in the psychology world, from what I'm aware of, evolutionary psychology is not too popular. There are some out there, of course, but by and large, the people I worked with thought evolutionary psychology was non-functional. It didn't help, and it did not help them help their patients. And therefore, they relied upon the traditional Rogerian techniques and Albert Ellis and so on. And so they, although most have a combination of several techniques, but nonetheless, I'm not aware of any evolutionary psychologist that is successful in treating patients. There may be some out there, but in my world, and I knew many therapists, I'm not aware of any that basically supported that worldview. And they thought it was foolish. It just didn't work. So the unanimous feeling of, or almost unanimous of psychologists is that evolutionary psychology is balderdash, as they say.
Well, Dr. Bergman, it sounds like you're saying that the Darwinian theory, it does more to hinder psychology than it does to progress it. However, what about other lines of evidence that evolutionary psychologists use to support their views? So, for instance, does the fact that we share traits with other organisms, such as sharing a serotonin-based nervous system with lobsters, does that indicate that human beings share a common ancestry with all life on Earth?
Well, it doesn't demonstrate common ancestry. What it demonstrates very clearly is that certain things are required, like ball bearings. Ball bearings are found in the simplest machines, like roller skates. They're also found in the most complex machines. But that doesn't mean the complex machines evolved from roller skates. It simply means that ball bearing is a functional unit which is part of so many things. In fact, the simpler example is these twirly things you put on your finger and you spin them around. Well, they have two rings and they have ball bearings in between there. Very, very simple. It doesn't do anything. It's just, I guess it's a fidget tool, which were quite popular at one time. But that doesn't mean anything evolved from these fidget tools. It means that there are certain structures like the production of serotonin that are important for, as far as I know, just about all multi-cell organisms. And there are so many other examples, like the cells, eukaryotic cells, for example, they all have pretty much the same design. And it's not because we evolved from the single eukaryotic life forms, but it's because these systems were important for life, like the mitochondria. All eukaryotes, as far as I know, have mitochondria. Even plant cells utilize mitochondria. So mitochondria is found throughout the living world, but that doesn't prove that living world evolved. It proves that the mitochondria is critical in charging ADP to ATP. And so that must be done because ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the universal coinage for life, and it's found in all life. And therefore, you must have a means of charging the ADP into ATP. Adenosine diphosphate becomes adenosine triphosphate. And it has nothing to do with evolution. It has to do with the requirements of life. Therefore, you find a lot of commonalities simply because of the requirements of life.
Dr. Bergman, we have now arrived at our final question. The Bible says, "For who hath known the mind of the Lord, that he may instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ." So, Dr. Bergman, how can we have the mind of Christ?
Well, study his life, study what he did, study what he said, study how he behaved, and try to imitate that, and try to behave like Christ, like you love your enemies. When challenged, he gave them good answers. He didn't get mad at people and say, you're an idiot, you're a stupid whatever. He didn't do that. He basically gave them, like the famous example, the coin. They gave him a coin, or he had a coin, and he said, who's on the coin? Well, Caesar. Therefore, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God. And so he responded in a way that turned away wrath. He responded with intelligent, correct, succinct answers, not with anger, not with saying, you stupid so-and-so, you are an idiot. And I find in the Darwinian world, all too often, they respond with anger, with nasty words. I just did an article the other day on a woman who wrote a Scientific American. She concluded that white racism is a result of rejecting evolution. And therefore, anti-evolutionists are obviously racist because of this connection. And it was pains to explain this. And she did a very poor job explaining this. And that's why I wrote the article. It was so easy to respond to. But I didn't respond by calling her names. I basically responded by showing where she was wrong. But she called us names. We were pseudoscientists. We were anti-reality. We are against science. We are opposed to science. And so she responded to us by calling names. And I responded to her, not by calling her names. But I did mention I was disappointed she should have done her research. I did mention she didn't do her research because it was very easy to respond to her claims. Very easy. And especially for Scientific American, a well-respected publication, it surprised me that they would publish it because she clearly did not do her research and made statements that are just totally wrong. I don't know anybody who rejected evolution and then became a racist as a result. I just don't. In fact, I don't know any creationists who are racist. And I spent a lot of time with creationists, and I'll be going to Indianapolis a couple of months from now. And in there, I speak mostly in Black churches and with Blacks. And it just, the idea of racism is just so foreign from creationists, it just is not. In fact, I have presentations I give which show how racist evolution is. And I was at a seminary of students and the professor there, and I gave my presentation on showing how Darwinism has fostered racism. And I show pictures of the evolutionary links. And you start out with a monkey, and then you end up with Australopithecines, and then you end up with Neanderthals, and then you end up with Blacks, African Americans, and then you end up with modern whites. And so the racism was clearly taught. in these books. These are textbooks that were used in our schools for years. And I have pictures of these that I use. And I show indeed that racism was taught in the textbooks in America for decades.
Well, Dr. Bergman, thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute joy. And to our listeners, thank you very much for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. You can find Dr. Bergman's biographical information, links to several of his video presentations, and his books in the description. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It's available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.